You'll go to hell if you've lived in sin. So say your prayers, 'cause here comes Grim.
Bonjour mes chéris, bienvenue dans ma rétrospective sur Cadwallon. Sombre, pourquoi as-tu une flasque communiste? Je regarde de l'alcool. Le plume de ma tante est sur la table. Bof, zut, etc. Why the French? Because it's a game from France. Today we are taking a retrospective look at the free city of Cadwallon, the player's handbook thereof. This was made by Rackham, which was a French company known for its tabletop miniatures game Confrontation. They were also known for the quality and the stylistic artistry of their miniatures, but ran into several problems that led to the company collapse. And because this is a retrospective rather than a review per se, I should probably go into that a little bit, because Rackham's a bit of a cautionary tale for a lot of people in gaming, and one that I think, well, the context and the circumstances are very different, but I think many people are at risk of falling into the same sorts of issues. See, success is not something that should lead to disaster, but it very often does, especially when something like, say, a Kickstarter or an Indiegogo or some other crowdfunding thing draws in loads more money than it was ever aiming for and then doesn't deliver on anything. Yeah, that's an example of success causing overreach and overreach leading to disaster. But that's kind of what happened to Rackham. They made a very big splash very quickly, had a rapid boom in popularity and availability, which may have made them overconfident and led to a bit of overreach. Part of that was an ill-judged shift to pre-painted miniatures, an effort that was meant to expand their audience, but one that cost more and alienated a huge section of their fan base. Something that also stung other businesses in the same period. You know, clicks and so on was fine, but for your hardcore minis buff, they like to be able to paint and construct their own minis and kit bash them and do all kinds of other things. Tellingly, pre-painted minis is not a mistake that Games Workshop ever really seemed to make. A lot of the ideas from another game they did or were involved in called AT-43 ended up in Dust Tactics, which also wound up. Those French, they can't keep a company going. They also churned out a whole bunch of other games and aggressively put on versions of the same game and aggressively pushed into international markets beyond their French and European roots, possibly too quickly. So when things went wrong, the company was massively overextended, and this, combined with some bad decisions and high costs, meant that they collapsed and entered bankruptcy in 2008, with everything kind of ending and wrapped up by 2010, though computer game makers Cyanide Studios and Fantasy Flight maintained access to some of the IP. I think Guilds of Cadwallon or something is a little mini board game that Fantasy Flight put out, and Cyanide Studios put out computer game playable versions of Confrontation, which have middling reviews. But if you search around, you can still find copies from miniatures, remolds of Rackham's minis still being made and sold, but the games and the company are 99% gone, apart from a few handfuls of enthusiasts, which is a huge shame and very sad. And which brings us finally, lengthily, to Cadwallon itself, which was their entry into the RPG market. This was 2006 or so. 4th edition D&D would come out in 2008, and both played into the miniatures / board game market. Though Rackham, of course, had their own minis, which D&D didn't. And Rackham's minis had done remarkably well, and their mini games had done remarkably well. They also, at the same time as this, pushed out a few game boards and other accessories, which were great quality, but the game itself was a wee bit of a bust. Iron Kingdom's own RPG would follow the same model and similarly run into trouble, so it would seem. So what does Cadwallon mean? Couldn't tell you for certain. In this instance, it's a city, an independent city-state run by mercenaries. But it either seems to be a reference to Welsh/Brittonic battle leaders, who were called Cadwallons, or to the Walloons, which is a European ethnic group centred around Flanders, France, Germany, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, but also scattered by diaspora around Canada, Finland, Belgium, Italy, South Africa, and Sweden. I suspect it's more the Welsh thing, because further in the background they're into this kind of Celtic mythology, which suggests they're aiming more for the Gaelic, but it could be either, Franco-Belgian stuff. But yeah, Confrontation's game world, in which Cadwallon is set, is called Aarkalash, and has a great deal of interesting lore and locations, most of which are now kind of semi-lost to history. Again, if you go looking, you can find materials. The RPG, however, is set very much within Cadwallon, a free city, home to mercenaries and factions of all kind, lots of urban intrigue and thievery and so on, which is great and all, but it's rather limiting in terms of scope and closes out quite a few other possibilities that you look for in RPGs. To me, that seems like too much of a narrowing from one of the chief strengths of TTRPGs, which is their scope and adaptability, after all. This is a hardback, high-quality, full-colour book of about 350 pages, which wasn't par for the course to the extent that it is now. But the busyness of many of the pages and the dark parchment of the background can make it a bit of a hard read, especially in dim light. Still, it definitely leveraged the artistic pedigree of Rackham and the legacy of art from their other products and made it work, and they gave a lot of artists that I really like a lot of work at the time. The writing in the book suffers quite enormously from half-arsed translation from French into English, which makes a lot of the prose rather awkward and seems to bleed somewhat into the game terminology. For example, to do something you roll a number of dice and you take the highest roll and then you add a bonus or take a penalty, and this is somewhat based on something called attitude, which seems like the wrong word to use. It's like how feeling kind of sexy and good in Chinese translates as comfortable. Orgasms aren't comfortable. It seems like almost British levels of understatement. Quite pleasant. I've arrived, madam. So yeah, it seems a little weird, and it isn't explained particularly well. The dice system is fairly simple, at least. You have a rating in dice. You roll that many dice, d6s, take the highest result and add +1 for each other dice that comes up with the same facing, and then modified by the attitude, attribute, whatever. So if you had 46 +1 and you rolled 6632, you'd have 6 +1 for the extra 6 and +1 for the modifier, making a total of 8, for example. Another confusingly worded idea is that of quality and potential. Quality is kind of how well you have succeeded, and potential is your potential capacity for success. Quality rates from 0 in whatever the character's potential to whatever the character's potential score is, and you can choose when you make a roll to increase the difficulty of your task by an amount up to that potential in order to raise the quality by that same amount. So, for example, if you chose to raise the quality of a roll you were making to run away from an enemy, the difficulty would then be higher for you, but if you succeeded, it would also be more difficult for those pursuing you. Which, if you picture it as someone running away from the guard and pausing a moment to knock over a bunch of caged chickens in the way or something, then you can kind of see what they're aiming for here. It's just not particularly well explained. The book gives you a brief overview of the world and a much better and more extensive background on the city. But I think they were relying perhaps too much, overly much, on your presumed familiarity with Confrontation and its books, the war game, the skirmish game, to carry you through. And at the time, I couldn't afford Confrontation, which was probably a good thing because it would have been wasted money. No, I bought into Dust Tactics instead. Lesson learned. The long and the short of it is that this is a Renaissance-ish setting with black powder, limited magitech, alchemy, magic, and other weirdness, alongside more primitive and more conventional fantasy elements, perhaps, like barbarian tribes. The dwarves have a technological air to them, a bit like the Mechanicum in Warhammer, actually, or religious reverence for machines and devices. It's not quite steampunk or magitech. It doesn't take it as far as, say, Iron Kingdoms, War Machine, Hordes, all that. It doesn't take the magitech quite as far as all that, but it does take it a bit further than, say, Warhammer, and it doesn't quite have the same satirical, humorous edge to it that a lot of Warhammer stuff does. It does have a kind of undefinable continental European feel to it, which made it feel very different and have its own identity compared to both American cod fantasy and British syncretic fantasy, which makes me wonder what a Canadian or Australian take on fantasy would be like, and how it would differ. More Native American influence, perhaps, or or other factors. France in Canada, Spain in America should have more of an influence on their setting. In Australia, maybe more of an Asian influence. I don't know. Anyway, train of thought went off the rails there for a sec. So there's a lot of detail in the book, but I question the usefulness of a lot of it, like calendars and holidays and details and things like that, which are certainly immersive, but they really require you to buy in and read in to the setting up front, which means there's quite a load on you if you're coming at the game entirely fresh and haven't learnt about things bit by bit by playing the other games. The city itself is replete with factions, intrigue, and other goings-on, so there's plenty of inspiration and ideas for quests and so on, albeit a bit concentrated in one city of many districts. That background and basic introductory concepts, that eats up about a third of the book, so it takes you to over 100 pages. Now, within the game, you can play a bunch of fantasy races, mostly typical ones: elves, goblins, humans, dwarves, ogres, orcs, and wolfen. The options weren't available for some of their other factions, at least not right away. There were 2 supplementary books released. Only one of them was released in English. The second one has been translated by fans. There was a 3rd book which never got released. Again, you can find information on most of this stuff online if you go looking and you're willing to put a little bit of effort into it. And that does kind of expand your options, but the additional races and things that they offer are meant for NPCs. So you don't really have the option to play undead or snake/lizard men. At least not without your games master bending the rules a little. Besides that, characters are defined by their attitudes. which you can view as basic attributes or as temperament or as an approach to a task. These vary from 0 to 6 and are pugnacity, sleight, style, opportunism, subtlety, and discipline. You're allowed to change your governing attitude each turn, which suggests that you're taking different approaches to things, but then skills are more tied to these attitudes or it doesn't explain itself well. But it's attitude and skill rather than convention ability plus skill that determines what you roll and what bonuses and so on you add. Your opportunism +1 is the base difficulty to hit you, it's your base defense, while your discipline +1 is the difficulty to mentally or emotionally influence you in some way. So there's a kind of like saves, but they're defense factors. Abilities are skills, which run from 0 to 5 and are grouped under different trades and different categories: exploration, confrontation, interaction, divination, incantation, and revolution. Revolution is the technology skill and ability. Your potential, which we touched on earlier, is a number between 1 and 12, which measures your overall experience and condition. It's the total from the sum of your 2 highest ranks in trades, and as you go up ranks in trades, that provides you levels in it's confusing and again not particularly well explained. Your race modifies some of these things, gives you some special features which tend to come in pairs. So if you have what other games would call a merit, it comes with a flaw, right? But if you get that merit twice, then the flaw disappears, and so you get the bonus without the penalties. It's a different form of balance, which I quite like as an idea. It's somewhat elegant. Being a minis company, they assume, much like with the Iron Kingdoms RPG, the non-D20 one, or with 4th edition D&D, they assume that you're going to be using miniatures or a board of some kind. Understandable, given the company, their speciality and the time and wanting to sell more minis, but wrong-headed in my opinion. Minis for RPGs should always be more optional than necessary. When you're rolling to do stuff, difficulties range from 2, easy, to 15, impossible, but most of the time you'll be looking at steps of 2 from 2 to 8. You take your roll, total, add your attitude value as a bonus. So say you had a sleight of 5, and you were rolling 4 dice, 2, 3, 4, 2, that would give you a total of 9, because 4's the highest, add the 5, 9. Good enough to beat a very hard difficulty. If all your dice come up 1, that's a botch, and you're in trouble. Whenever you're in opposition to an active opponent, whatever it is, whether it's social or physical combat or whatever else, things break into rounds. Now the rounds can technically be of any length, they don't have to be combat turns. They can take place over weeks or months, like if you're manoeuvring through the underworld to try and get more sales of an alchemical drug or something than a rival gang. That could be done over weeks or months or whatever. But each turn you get a pool of dice at the start equal to your potential, and you can split those dice between active and reactive pools. And again, this is fiddly, but it's quite a nice idea. You spend dice from these pools to do stuff, either to give you dice to roll or spend them to do things that are automatic, which are just called facts. So it's a way of limiting your actions in the turn and how many dice you can devote to anything. An interesting aspect, I find, a nice aspect, which won't work in Theatre of the Mind necessarily, but the reach of a weapon counts as a bonus unless you don't have enough room to swing that weapon properly or raise it effectively, in which case it counts as a penalty. So a pikeman in open field gets a +3 bonus due to the excessive reach of his weapon. This makes spears quite useful, for example. But in the narrow corridors of a castle with all its murder holes and whatever else, if you've got a pike and you're up against someone with a dagger, you're probably in some deep shit. At the end of a turn, You lose whatever dice you have in your smallest remaining pool from your active or reactive pool. You retain the dice in the larger pool, and then you get your pool and you add it and split it again between the two. So if you hang back and don't do anything for a while, you can build up a nice pool of either active or reactive and then unleash them all in one go. There's fiddly bits here like going all in and initiative being determined by how many dice you have in your active pool, but yeah, you get the gist. Characters are created using Origin, which is your race, which gives you a boost to a certain attitude, determines your size, base hit points, movement, your power, which is how much combat damage you do as a base, natural weapons, distinctive features. In combat, your damage is your power times d6 plus the damage of the weapon minus protection from armor. Hit points are in levels, so you have a death spiral of the more wounded you get. So, yeah, people know and understand how that works. Hit points is hit points per level, which descends, so you go from unhurt to light wound, serious wound, critical wound, incapacitated, deceased. After your origin, your race, you choose your culture. Not all of them are necessarily compatible with each other, but it's between you and your games master. Your culture adds +2 between certain attitudes, grants you cultural skills at 2, and some sort of cultural contact, also at level 2, along with a distinctive feature or trait. And again, if these double up, then you get the bonus without the penalty. Trades are next, and this is, again, slightly confusing. You can choose one trade at rank 3, a trade at rank 2 and rank 1, or 3 trades at rank 1. And each rank in a trade grants you certain skills and other bits and bobs, and determines your starting gear as a character. It isn't described particularly well and is a bit fiddly, but it kind of works if you squint. If you want to do magic, of course, this is where you choose your trade to be one of the incantation or divination trades. So priests, magicians, alchemists, that sort of thing. Most magic is based on the elements, earth, air, fire and water. Mana is a force in the world which crystallizes into gemstones, and magicians carry around a case of gems from which they weave their magic. And magic comes in different paths, each with different traditions of gestures, words and objects that unlock the mana in the gems and make the spell go boom, as well as different spells within their varying traditions with different costs and difficulties. Yeah, that's part of the whole thing. There is 2 kinds of mana gems. There are ephemeral ones, which are used up when they're used up, and there are other ones which are more permanent, and they regenerate their mana over time and can even be coaxed to regenerate their mana even faster. Needless to say, ephemeral ones are cheaper. There's also a separate magic system of cartomancy using the tarot, but that's even harder to understand than the regular magic is. Again, it's a problem with language, I think, the translation from French into English. And it's a pity because it's much more characterful and flavourful and is particular to Cadwallon and its region. Religious magic draws on faith, which is generated each turn based on a character's own religious fervour and their location or the amount of believers around. So if you're a fanatic in a cathedral to your faith, you're going to be getting a lot of faith points each turn with which to cast your magic. If you're Father Dougal in a temple to an entirely different god, you're not going to be doing too well on the old magic front there. Religious magic comes in 3 basic forms: light, dark and destiny, and religious spells are divided into different litanies, each containing a variety of miracles which have different costs in terms of faith points with which to cast them. Revolutionary stuff is techno magic. in the form of black powder, magical steam. It's part magic, part technology, more technology than magic in a lot of ways, but there's a lot of hand waving to explain certain things like automatons and how they work and so on. So like, it's a retrospective, not really a review per se, but since we're here, style wise I give it a high 4. I mean, their artwork has always been fantastic. I like the sketches as well as the full colour pieces. I like most of the artists that they tapped to do a lot of the work. That was always a great thing about what Rackham did, was the presentation, the artwork, just breathtaking, and the miniatures still stand up today, 10 getting on to 20 years later. And well worth purchasing if you're a minis collector and you can find them. But the style gets in the way a lot of the time. It's not very well laid out to explain itself as a game. It's not particularly readable because of the dark parchment background. It has issues, shall we say. So I would love to give it a 5 purely on the basis of the quality of the artwork and the imagination of the world and so on, but it eats into the practicality. So style-wise, a high 4, say 4.5. Substance-wise, I mean, this is a deadline that was never even gotten close to a level of completion while it was a live line. So it's a dead line and a dead game from a dead company, so it's incomplete, though you can find bits and bobs and explanations from online wikis and abandonware PDFs and so on. The rights issue is opaque, shall we say. The content is good, but overwhelming and poorly translated, and there's no index. So I guess 3.5 for substance, because it's interesting and good and different, still all those things today. It's just the translation and the usability is so poor, the readability is so poor. I mean, not quite as bad as Morkborg, but getting there. So that's 4.5 plus 3.5. So that is still 8 out of 10, even with all the drawbacks. So that's 4 out of 5, which is good. It means I recommend it, but you've got to work at it, and that's the problem. As an artifact of Rackham, for me, as in my archivist role, it's interesting as it kind of consolidates the moment they overreached. I think the 3/4-assed effort that Cadwallon says a lot about Rackham and where they were at the time and everything else. But it is interesting as a kind of avatar of that time and place in the industry and in the French role-playing industry, and as an artifact that looks at the road slightly less travelled, and a testament to the fact that too much success is a bad thing, and that good looks and good ideas just aren't enough in this industry, as well as the importance of effective translation. The rules are interesting, and they're possibly worth someone cloning at some point, apart from the magic, which needs quite a bit of work when it comes to this game. So there you go, I suppose. It does have a certain je ne sais quoi, which is appropriate, and good luck finding a copy because they're all massively expensive everywhere. I looked. Very occasionally you can find a cheaper copy somewhere. Second-hand piles at conventions, or very rarely eBay. A few stores have a few copies still in stock in back rooms somewhere, which just goes to show another part of the problem. It just didn't really sell. Didn't stand out enough, despite everything. Which is a shame. I feel bad that this was not more of a success. And we'll end it there. Zang. On a crazy whim, I recorded the almost entire 5th edition D&D SRD as an audiobook, and you can pick that up, pay what you want on DriveThruRPG, or you can listen to it on a playlist on my YouTube channel, post-bottom video.